So just to complete Moritz's introduction, I think the part that's relevant here is I will be doing a case study on the telco industry and how it's relevant to us in the payment industry. I'll explain later on why that actually makes a lot of sense. But just to explain my experience in telco, after leaving Standard Bank, where I ran payments and was very involved in payment innovation. I was the chief digital officer for Vodacom for about 2.5 years, and then for about 5 years, I was the chief digital officer for MTN. And for the last 2 years or so, I've been on the board of Telcom. But I'm also an advisor. I've advised Verizon in the United States. I'm working with Airtel in India. I've worked with Saudi Telecom in Saudi Arabia, and so I've got a very deep understanding of the telco space. And there's a reason for that, and I'll explain why shortly. So I've titled this "Training Elephants to Dance," and later on you'll see why I picked elephants. But at a very simplistic level, the big challenge in any industry is that you've got multiple ecosystems, multiple verticals, different sizes of players, different concentric circles, which is the way that we've modeled it. And really the question is, how do you overcome this when you have to make a fundamental change, which is exactly what happened in the telco industry. So I'm just going to talk about the challenge that we have, how you should think about change, what industry change challenges are, quick case study, and then maybe I'll share with you how we thought about it to get the telco industry to change. The big challenge with change is when we ask who wants to change, everybody puts their hand up. Well, who wants change? Everybody puts their hand up. But when we ask the question, who wants to change? Well, all you hear is crickets, right? So the problem is I guess we all want change, but nobody wants to be the driver of change, and nobody wants to be impacted by change. This is a very interesting graph. I like showing this graph. It's probably the scariest of my 10,000 slides. Um, that I have in my database. It's a slide that shows you how long companies have remained in the Standard and Poor's 500 index. So the S&P 500 is the index of the biggest companies in the world. It was started in the early 1900s. By 1960, most companies that were the 500 companies that started in the index in the 1900s, in the early 1900s, were still there. So they were the average age of the companies in the index was 60 years. Almost no companies had left. By 1980, it had dropped to 35 years. So it halved. And by kind of 2020, we were down to 18 years, and we're heading basically towards 12 years. If effectively companies get big quickly, but they struggle to remain big, they struggle to survive. And so they're successful almost in a burst. And the question is, why does this happen? Because this happens not just to companies, it happens to industries. And the main reason that this happens, and people, I guess Jack Welch is a little bit deprecated now, but I liked this quote of his. He said, if the rate of change on the outside of a company or an industry exceeds the rate of change on the inside, the end is near. And I think this is a very, very important comment for all of us to bear in mind, not just, I guess, for the purpose of this project, but in our personal lives, our skills, even our companies, and even in the payments industry overall. So the law that governs this is known as MarTechs Law. And MarTechs Law is the law of disruption. It basically says technology changes far faster than anything else in our lives. The next quickest thing that changes is actually customers. Customers change very quickly after technology. When technology arrives, customers are quick to adopt it. Businesses lag, and industries lag even further behind, and regulation and political change comes last. And so the way in which, and this is one of the big reasons that we have disruption in the world, is the fact that change varies at different speeds. Technology moves quickly, consumers get left behind, they catch up, they leave their businesses behind. The businesses then struggle and launch innovations. They try to catch up. The industry is scrambling to get the new operating models right. And then regulators are scrambling to get the rules right for everyone. So the challenge you have is we get a lot of companies going bankrupt because of this. If you look at what happened with Kodak, you can see that this disruption happened slowly, then suddenly. And that's the way in which a lot of these changes happen. And so if you look at the sales of film up to 2000, you can see it was still rising, and then suddenly you had this catastrophic collapse over a period of 5 years. The same is true with camera sales. You can see camera sales were growing. Analog camera sales were growing up to 2000, and then you saw this catastrophic collapse. Um, and I'll share with you what happened in the telco industry, which is exactly the same as this. The same happened to Netflix and Blockbuster. You can see gradual decline and then sudden catastrophic collapse. And so the nature of this beast is that as this gap between internal and external change increases, it builds. It's almost like an avalanche. It's like you can keep adding snow, to a pile of snow, nothing happens, and then suddenly you get a shock, and then you get this avalanche, and the entire thing just falls. And in the case of, for example, work from home, and the adoption of digital, it was COVID. COVID was the trigger for the avalanche, because when COVID hit, suddenly consumers adopted technology, businesses adopted technology, governments passed laws and said you must use technology. More spectrum became available. Data prices were driven down. We changed the laws and allowed people to work from home. And so, in a way, it's Vladimir Ilitchik makes this very interesting comment. He says there are decades where nothing happens, and then there are weeks where decades happened. And in fact, I would say between March and April 2020, we probably had 10 years worth of change. 10 years worth of change happened in about 10 weeks. Okay, and so this trigger can be anything. So I want to just share with you this case study of the change that happened in the telco industry and how rapid it was, because it follows exactly the same model. Now, why is the telco industry a great case study for payments? Firstly, it's heavily regulated at a national level. It's also an international industry. You've got to move pieces of information across border and nationally. It's license-based and network-based. It's $1 trillion revenue and valuation in this industry. There's hundreds of interconnected players of different sizes, scales, focuses, strategies. There's different verticals, different niches. There's been intensive investment in infrastructure over decades, and for decades, the law has been infrastructure ownership equals access. If you didn't build it, you can't use it. And it was heavily affected by digitization. So I'll share with you shortly why I picked the telco industry, because the telco industry was heavily affected by digitization. In fact, the telco industry got digitized before the banking industry got digitized. And that's why we can learn from them, because in a way, they're kind of, I would hazard a guess and say, the telco industry is about 7 years in front of us. What do I mean by that? Well, the first industry that really imploded because of what happened in 1996, in 1995. 1995, Nokia came out with a camera on their phone, which was quickly adopted by everybody else. And Nokia then came out with Nokia Comes with Music. You might remember that. And that fundamentally began the disruption of the media industry. So the first industry to be disrupted was media. The second industry to be disrupted was communications. And I'll share with you how that happened. The third industry to be disrupted was the retail, e-commerce, basically, um, and travel. And the fourth industry that's currently being disrupted is banking. So if you go and look at the music industry and the video industry, you can see it's that they've been through incredible turmoil in the kind of 2000s, the early 2000s. We saw music labels going bust. We saw studios getting redesigned. We saw Netflix coming out, fundamentally changing the way. And it's going through in fact, a transformation right now. So the media industry, newspapers, magazines, gaming have all been transformed. So media was first, communications was second, retail was third, and banking is fourth. Now, change is never painful. It's only the resistance to change that's painful. And the reason for this is really the fact that there's a tipping point, and the tipping point is this avalanche that happens. So I was at Vodacom in 2013 when the first DMs came out. You'll remember that the first DMs were things like this. I'm just going to share it with you quickly. I'm going to step forward. You'll remember these DMs. You'll remember BlackBerry and Mixit came out, right? And these were direct messaging systems. And the direct messaging systems basically came out. And I remember having this debate with Shamil. Shamil said, "Oh, it's rubbish, man. We'll just give away 10,000 SMSs for 20 bucks." And the comment was, well, Mixit's free, right? Mixit's free and BBM's free. How are you going to compete against free with 10,000 SMSs? Isn't this the death of SMSs? And basically the tipping point was in that time, in that time, basically, Mixit took over, and when Mixit took over, it killed SMSs, and BBMs took over, it killed SMSs. And so today, if you go and look at your SMS mailbox, you'll see the only person sending you love in your SMS mailbox is not people. It's not a P2P service anymore. The whole SMS business had to transition and pivot. Today, it's an application to person business. You'll go in there and you'll have a look. It's marketing, it's scams, it's insurance companies, it's SMSs with banks and one-time passwords. It's actually applications sending you messages. And that tipping point happened in around 2012, 2013. So the telco industry is governed by a voluntary association. It's called the GSMA. GSMA stands for Global System for Mobile Comms. It's originally French for Group Special Mobile. And so the GSMA is the GSM association. It spans 220 countries. It's got 800 of the mobile operators in the world, and it's got more than 230 companies involved that are in the broader ecosystem. It owns and operates the Mobile World Congress in Barcelona. So the GSMA represents members via industry programs, working groups, and industry advocacy initiatives. Now, it's interesting to look at the governance structure of the GSMA, because this is the structure. This is the board of the GSMA, and up until probably I would say 3 years ago, the chairman of the board of directors of the GSMA was actually Rob Shooter from MTN. Was the chairman. He actually chaired it for a few years until he left. This is the structure of the GSMA. It's very similar to PASA. You've got an audit risk committee, compensation, nominations, policy, technology, etc. Now, I served on the technology group. So basically, my role at the GSMA was to serve on the strategy group, I beg your pardon, and to influence the strategy of the entire industry. In other words, how is this industry now going to drive? How is this group going to drive the industry forward? So I want you to look at this as a very small group of people at the center, driving a very large number of people who were distributed in the industry. Now, it's important to look at the industry overall. So if you look at the industry, you'll see that the industry was driven by killer apps. The first killer app in 1981 was really with 1G phones was voice. Voice is what drove the industry. Revenue has exploded. Then in 1992, we invented 2G, and what then drove the industry was text. So text was the killer app, and people were just texting each other, and that became the driver. In 2001, what drove the industry was with 3G was surfing. So we had HSDPA, Edge, etc., and GPRS. You'll remember those things, and that allowed us to surf the internet for the first time. Then along came 4G in 2011, and what that gave us was video. So if you're going to look at the internet today and mobile networks, the bulk of what we move on the network is video. It's probably 70% of all the traffic on the internet. Human-based traffic is video. The bulk of the traffic, by the way, on the internet today is actually machines talking to machines. It's actually non-human readable content. And of the half that humans are using, 70% of that half is actually video. So if you look at this, what really powered the industry is four distinct waves which drove revenue. Right? We first paid for voice, then we paid for text, then we paid for data, and we paid for access, then we paid for data, and then we paid for unlimited data, and we paid for speed. Right? And so now we've launched 5G, and the jury's still out on what the killer app is going to be for 5G. So the industry was very lucky, because what that did is that created enormous market capitalizations. AT&T was worth $240 billion. That's half of Tesla. China Mobile's worth 220 million. Verizon was worth 210. If you look at the biggest M&A deals in the history of the world, the biggest deal ever done in the history of the world between any company in any industry in any country was Vodafone buying Mannesmann in 1999 for $200 billion. That's how valuable these companies had become. The fifth biggest deal in the history of the world was Vodafone buying Verizon in America for $130 billion. Right? So just think about that. Two of the five biggest deals in the history of the world with one telco taking over another telco. So these industries became enormous, very profitable, very successful. Then something happened. If you look at the return on invested capital in different industries, you can see that telecommunications industries, right at the bottom, second from the bottom, is the second lowest return on invested capital. And so the way to think of this is something happened, right? So between the 80s all the way up to kind of 2000, the industry was booming. There was then an overinvestment in infrastructure, and you saw companies like Marconi and Global Wireless all go bust. They'd overinvested in infrastructure. But then we saw the second growth cycle. We saw text coming in, and the world looked really rosy. And then suddenly, all the wheels fell off, and the industry really began to lose revenue and was forced to change. What really caused this was a number of things. It was largely a function of the perverse incentives in the industry. You see, the first problem you had in the industry is out of bundle. So if you bought a bundle and you carried on calling after your bundle expired, you'd get nailed on price. If you roamed on another network, you'd get nailed. If you roamed overseas, you'd get nailed. You had massive bill shock. you had something called mobile termination rates. So in other words, it's very similar to payments. It's like issuing and acquiring. And if you use your phone to phone someone on another network, they would terminate your call on that network. And then there would be a settlement between the networks. And what you could artificially do is if you artificially increased issuing and acquiring, the banking industry would make more money. Well, that's what the telco industry did, right? Globally, is they increased the termination rates, and the governments had to step in and push that down. Long distance calling then became a big problem if you phoned overseas, which actually didn't make sense because it's like sending an email. It doesn't matter where you send the email to, but long distance calling also hammered users. The next problem was SMSs were massively overpriced. I mean, I think we were charging 25 cents. I don't know if you remember 25 cents for an SMS. I mean, I remember I was a Standard Bank and I was furious that every time we sent out a one-time password, I had to pay 25 cents. And I had huge fights with the telcos because you see, actually SMSs are free for a telco. They shouldn't even be charging. And in fact, at that time, and even up to today, the most expensive form of data transfer in the world is an SMS. If you look at the price per bit, it's the most expensive thing that you can send. This resulted in massive bill shock. You then had customer dissatisfaction with expiration of bundles. And the responses of the telco was, well, why don't you make phone calls after hours? Which is absolutely horrible. Imagine if the banking industry said it's cheaper to bank after hours. You'd get a total revolt in the industry. And then, of course, there were all of these other issues with micro fees. And you had these VAS players who basically would effectively steal money out of your account by subscribing you to services that you didn't want. Not dissimilar to the debit order problem we faced. So you can see the challenge that this industry had was customers were very unhappy with the industry, and there was a great opportunity to totally disrupt the telco industry. So obviously, BBM and Mixit went after the texting side of the industry, and this killed SMSs. And people don't realize that this was a billion-rand industry, probably a 4 to 5 billion between all the telcos. But this was a multi-billion-rand industry that evaporated overnight. And so then the next big shock happened in 2007. In 2007, um, something unusual happened. It's called strategic decoupling. You see, up until 2007, if you look at Nokia, Motorola, BlackBerry, the handset, the operating system, and the application all came from one company. BBM came from BlackBerry, the handset came from BlackBerry, and the BlackBerry operating system came from BlackBerry. So if you bought a BlackBerry, everything came from BlackBerry. If you had a Nokia and you were using a Nokia comes with music, the music player came from Nokia, the operating system Symbian came from Nokia, and the handset came from Nokia. What Apple then did in 2007 is they said, we're going to decouple the applications. We're going to allow you to bring applications from anywhere, but we're going to give you the operating system and the hardware as Apple. Well, that caused a huge shock to the industry, right? Because suddenly anybody could deploy an application. Remember, Mixit was a Java application that had been squeezed onto a Java-based phone. And what Apple did is Apple made that much easier. Well, that killed BBM and that killed Mixit the minute they did that. But it also guaranteed that SMSs would die. Google then sat back and said, wow, this is a huge threat to us because Apple's going to take this entire mobile industry away. So Google quickly rushed out and created an Android equivalent. And what they did, they went even further. They created Android, gave it away for free at the time, and then they allowed every other player in the industry. So they said to the handset manufacturers, the telcos, everybody was threatened by Apple. They said, why don't we work together against Apple? We'll go one step further. Where Apple separated out the applications, but kept the operating system and the hardware, what Google said was, why don't we separate out the operating system as well? So Google then said the apps can come from one company. You get WhatsApp from one company, you get Android from Google or Samsung's flavor of Android, and you get the hardware from Huawei, for example. Right? So basically, what you've got now is you've got 3 different companies supplying everything on a phone, and so the entire industry just got decoupled. Well, that had a huge impact because you moved effectively the entire industry from mobile telephony, where we only had 4 apps in 2007, voice, text, contacts, and camera, to a world where 2 years later you had 700,000 apps, right? And you moved from mobile telephony to mobile computing. Now, this is a radically new model. And I want you to remember these words, a radically new model, because I'm going to come back and talk about this, because this is the challenges that we were faced with as an industry. We had to deal with this problem, right? So now you've got a big problem because under mobile telephony, distribution was important. Services distribution came from the telco, and basically the telco competed on reliability and scale. The minute you moved to mobile computing, you had a problem because now mobile platforms were driving this out, and telcos were competing on price. And suddenly there was lots of choice, and telcos were suddenly in a very difficult place. In a sense, I guess we're incumbents in the payment space as we move forward. And what really caused this was the explosion of social media apps, what we refer to in the telco industry as OTTs, over the top players. In other words, these are people that utilize our infrastructure. So the telco industry put in the undersea cables, the data centers, the fiber, the microwave, the towers, the UPSs, the radio access network. We went and paid for the spectrum. We got the licenses, very similar to banks, right? We did exactly the same thing. And then along come these players who build these little apps, and they run on top of the network that we built, and they basically cannibalized all of our revenue. To give you an example, on the right-hand side, the dark blue is long-distance phone calls on the network up to 2016. And you can see by 2016, Skype had passed our traffic. Skype was free, and we were charging. And by 2016 already, long-distance calls had vanished, right? Because basically the apps we're taking long-distance calls and saying we're going to make them free. Why should you pay more to make a phone call to another country? It just doesn't make sense. And so basically these social media apps impacted core revenue. We went from text messaging being destroyed to long distance phone calls being destroyed. And this collapsed the industry. So if you look at what happened to Nokia, BlackBerry, and Motorola, they went bankrupt in 3 years. Again, this avalanche, right? Change happened slowly and then suddenly. So you had this avalanche in 3 years. You saw this massive collapse, and suddenly out of nowhere came Apple and Samsung. And that all happened between 2009 to 2012. The number 1, 2, and 3 player in the industry changed. Now I don't know any industry in the world where that happens, where in 3 years the top 3 players all change. So you had this huge growth in Android and Apple, and we saw massive downloads of apps, big growth in app revenue, and lots of time being spent on the new apps. We stopped spending time on the green button for the SMS and the green button for call, right, or answer. That's not where our time was. Pre 2007, the most important apps on your phone were SMS, the SMS box, and the green button for calling. And going forward, those 2 buttons aren't being used anymore. So when you look at what happened to revenue, the transformation is astonishing. On the right-hand side, the blue bar is basically where the revenue was in 2010, right? And the red piece is the increase in revenue between 2010 and 2018. So on the right-hand side are all the telco operators: AT&T, Verizon, China Mobile, Deutsche Telekom, America Mobile. And you can see the problem, right? The problem is, and I talk to these chief strategy officers every day, because this is the problem they faced with. Over a 10-year period, they've had almost no increase in revenue. Now go to the extreme left-hand side. Look at Amazon, Alphabet, Microsoft, Facebook. I mean, Facebook didn't even have revenue in 2010. You can see in the blue bar, they had very low revenue in 2010, and you have this enormous jump in revenue. And if you look at Apple, Samsung, and Huawei, you can see some of the OEMs also saw an increase in revenue. And in China, you can see a similar thing. So clearly, the telco industry created the value, but the telco industry didn't capture the value. So if you look at the growth in market cap, right, the telco industry is here in blue, is 165 telcos, and these are the 7 internet giants. By 2017, 7 companies which were over the top players were worth more than 165 telcos. So the telco industry created the value by putting the infrastructure in, but the over the top players captured all the value. And that's the problem. It is very similar to what everyone's fearful of in the banking industry. So what did we do? What did the industry do? And so the first thing we did as an industry is we said, look, look, first we went through lots of soul searching, and a lot of this was people crying into their tea. And then we said, look, we have to embrace this. So we started to partner with the tech giants. We, for example, co-invested with Google on undersea cables. We partnered Facebook on their satellite. It blew up eventually, but they then bought capacity on another satellite. But Facebook satellite, the telco industries were happy to do what's called last mile. We would do the sales and the revenue collection for Facebook to enable Wi-Fi in rural areas. They were doing us a favor, right? Because Facebook satellite would actually help us. But Facebook couldn't do the last mile. We could do the last mile. So again, very similar to the payment industry. We also partnered with Google Loon, which was the concept of of balloons. We said, well, we'll do the last mile for you. You get the balloons up, we'll partner with you. And we worked with Elon Musk with Starlink and said, that's fine. You'll put these networks up. You're going to need people on the ground to help service support handsets, etc. We'll do that for you. What regulators then did is, because the first thing we tried as an industry, not we, but the Americans tried this, Verizon, AT&T, and T-Mobile, they started to throttle people like Netflix and Spotify. Said, no, 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 we're going to slow you down. We put the infrastructure in, we're going to slow you down. And the regulators came in and implemented net neutrality and said all traffic on the network has to be treated the same, has to be treated equally. And net neutrality says you cannot give preference to your traffic over somebody else's traffic. And that created a huge change in the industry, but we had to accept that that's actually the only way that you can operate. So some of these changes were imposed from the outside. The industry then realized that, look, we have to accept that ownership of assets is no longer a way to compete. So we began to spin out assets. MTN's done it, Vodacom's done it, and MTN at Telcom's announced it's doing it. And this is a huge industry today. So the first thing we did is we said, can we share infrastructure, which is what Cellci's done. The next thing they said was, can we carve out, all the fiber, the data centers, the radio access network, and the towers, and can we put it into a specialized company that just owns that, and we'll focus on services. We'll all become MVNOs. And so the industry began to specialize. Some industries became infrastructure players and became turned into utilities. Some players like Reliance Jio, for example, in India, became a full digital lifestyle services provider. And so you had different telcos saying, look, I'm going to play in different spaces. Um, the infrastructure space is very capital intensive, low revenue, but it's steady revenue, and there's very little disruption. Other industries went to the other side and said, well, I'll start building super apps. And so you've got companies playing in different spaces. At MTN, for example, we launched e-commerce business, we launched mobile money, we launched music, we launched videos, we launched a ride-hailing app in Iran. We launched a super app called Jumia, which we listed on the New York Stock Exchange for $4 billion. I was the deputy chairman of that company. And so we moved into what's called adjacencies. And so we had industry-wide collaboration on adjacencies. So I set up a JV between MTN and Orange and Tigo. Now, they're not competitors because they actually, Orange was only in French-speaking Africa, Tigo was only in Central Africa, and MTN pretty much dominated English-speaking Africa. We competed with Vodacom. And we said, why don't we, the three of us, get together and build an e-commerce business, which we did. And then we listed it on the New York Stock Exchange. The second thing we did with them is we got together and we said, why don't we build a mobile wallet, which we did. And why don't we create interconnection between the mobile wallet? And why don't we build a cross-border clearinghouse? Right. And so we basically built all these things in collaboration with each other. But these were all bilaterals. Right. So we invited Vodafone, and Vodafone didn't want to play because Safaricom had M-Pesa and they didn't want to contaminate M-Pesa. But the rest of us said, well, we'll just interconnect. We then built, we started building, and then we started building dedicated products for the industry jointly. We then rolled out common technology like 5G, voice over IP, rural connectivity. We all had the same problem. We said, we've got the same problem here. Let's solve it together. Then we found we had the same opportunity, which is to get rid of the SIM card and create what's called an embedded SIM or an eSIM. So we as an industry, we wrote the specifications for the eSIM and said, let's get rid of the SIM card. So if you get an Apple, the Apple comes with a SIM card fully embedded in it, and Apple can then become a wholesaler of airtime. Apple signs you up, and you can choose on your eSIM which telco you want. And as you move around South Africa, you can switch from Vodacom, MTN to Telkom, and the user has choice depending on the signal strength. So we created all of these things together. Another thing that we created was something called Mobile Connect. We built this product as an industry. Mobile Connect was basically designed to manage identity. We basically said the big problem in the world is everyone's trying to figure out who you are. E-commerce is trying to figure it out. Banks are trying to figure it out. Identity, governments are trying to figure it out. You need it for voting. You need it for health. Why don't we build a single identification service that anybody can use? and we built it. It's called Mobile Connect, and Mobile Connect was then launched, and it launched in 2015. And I was part of the team that rolled this out. And effectively, we ended up with 2.5 billion mobile users worldwide. Because one of the lessons we learned was actually, if the telco industry had cannibalized itself, we should have built Mixit. We should have bought Mixit and turned Mixit into WhatsApp. That's what we should have done as an industry. We didn't do that. Somebody else did it to us. And so we lost the opportunity. So we then decided, let's not lose the opportunity in identity. So we built this, we rolled it out. It's available, but the problem we're now having is you now have a standard product, but you're now reliant on each telco to launch it. So although it's available, it hasn't been adopted as broadly. So, if you look here, you'll see GSMA's Mobile Connect available to 2 billion consumers globally, but it really hasn't been used as much as we'd like. So this is an example of getting the whole industry to coordinate. We all kind of agree at the center, but when you go out, the marketing manager at China Mobile will say, that's not my priority. We're not going to launch this. So in closing out, folks, so some of the key industry-specific lessons were we had perverse incentives. There was a land grab. Net neutrality was imposed on us. Open architecture and decoupling was a technical innovation that changed the landscape. A lot of the things we did were too tactical initially. We then started to focus on more co-opetition, consolidation, and we saw a lot more specialization. Different parties began to realize, look, it doesn't make sense for me to play in this space. I'm going to move. We saw consolidation, smaller parties getting broken up, and we saw a more sustainable industry emerge. So some of the lessons are really you want to compete on value add, not on utility. So in other words, don't compete on infrastructure. That's not where the competition is. And don't compete on access. Compete on the value that you add to that. That's really where all the telcos have gone now. All of them are launching super apps, got nothing to do with telcos and communication. And the key point here, folks, is that change is a social problem. It's not a technical problem. Right? So that's really some of the key lessons. I'm going to just wrap up in the next 5 minutes by just sharing with you some of the theory. Right? The theory behind this is really that the world moved. The world moved from a world where the technology that we were using and the requirements of customers were very well understood. Home phones, right? That was a very, and a dial with a cable. That was a very obvious or a very simple world. Then gradually we moved to mobile phones, and the first mobile phones will starting to get a bit complicated now because the technology and the requirements are less certain. Now we moved into this decoupled world where the technology and the requirements are very uncertain. And that's what's happening in payments, right? We're moving from obvious to complicated to complex. And that requires a different way of thinking about your industry. Buckminster Fuller was a physicist who was very involved in creating graphene, which is a carbon-based molecule that's going to change the world. He said, you never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, you need to build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. And that's, in a sense, how we need to think about where the payment industry is going, because really we're entering a new model where the old way of thinking just not going to work anymore. So the way that we attacked it, because at the GSMA Center, we were trying to change 800 telcos globally. And what we tried to do was to firstly focus on what you could call unfreeze. You had to unfreeze the way that people think. Then you had to change them, and then you had to refreeze. Now you're trying to do that across 220 countries and 800 telcos in an industry that's hugely threatened, where everybody's got their own priorities and agendas. Is very difficult. So one of the ways we thought about this it's a methodology called Switch, which is written by two brothers called Chip and Dan, and really, and this is why I use the analogy of the elephant. How do you change things when change is hard? And we took this philosophy that really what you want to do is if you're at the center and you're trying to change the entire industry, what you want to do is if you want to get the elephant to go anywhere, you first have to tell the rider where you want to go, direct the rider. The second thing that you want to do is you want to motivate the elephant. Elephant by definition is lazy. It's lazy and it's not interested in moving and it's interested in today only. Thirdly, it needs to know where it wants to go. So if you can't figure out these three things, you can't make any change. You got to figure out who is the rider, how do we motivate the elephant, and how do you shape the path. So if you think about it at an individual level, your rational brain is actually the rider, and your emotional brain is the elephant. Because the rational brain says, wake up early, and the emotional elephant brain says, I still want to sleep. And so that's the problem, right? The rider has got to override the elephant. At a company level, the rider is the executive, and the broad staff base is the elephant, because the rider wants to maybe say we got to cut costs or become more agile, but the existing staff are saying no, we don't really want to change. And at an industry level, the PIB is the rider. The PIB and the regulator, I guess, are the rider. And the industry at large is the elephant, because the industry is saying, well, why do we have to change? We don't really want to change. So how do you get this right? What gets in the way? What gets in the way really is because what gets in the way usually is because it's the elephant. Right? The elephant is much stronger than the rider. The industry is much stronger than the PIB. It's lazy, it prefers immediate gratification over delayed gratification. I'm earning my bonus today. Why do I need to change? And also, the rider may want to avoid candy today to be slimmer tomorrow, but the elephant wants the candy today. And so that's the problem. That's how we thought about this. So we said, how did we change the industry? We said, firstly, you got to direct the rider. You got to provide crystal clear direction about where this industry is going. And then you got to figure out what often looks like resistance is often because we haven't been clear. That's where resistance comes from. Then we've got to figure out how to motivate the elephant. How do you motivate the elephant? Because we've got more elephants than riders, and the elephant's stronger than the rider. So the elephant's going to need more emotional reasons to change and rational reasons. And what looks like laziness is just often exhaustion. I've just got too many things to do. I can't do this on top of everything else. Finally, what you've got to do is you've got to overcome resistance by shaping the path. Now, there's a very good formula for this. And the change formula says change only happens if you create dissatisfaction with the current state, you create a clear vision of where we're going to be, and you tell them what we're going to do next. And together, that's got to be greater than the resistance. If you can get this right, then you can change. So in the telco industry, change happened because we were all seeing this bleeding of revenue. We created this vision of a digital telco 2.0, and we then showed them what we could do by launching products to get them into the value-added space. And gradually over time, that began to change the resistance. So today, for example, if you look at any telco in the world, their non-voice revenue is 70% of their revenue. And if you went back 5 or 8 years, voice revenue is what drove a telco. So the telcos have all moved away. They've all overcome resistance. Folks, so in closing out, change management is crucial. The industry can change, and industries can change. We had a big job to save the telco industry globally. We're all actually leaders of change. We have to deal with resistance to change. There are a number of tools we can use, and we really have to think like the elephant, the rider here, because that's our role, is to be the rider, and we've got to figure out ways that we can change the industry. And I hope that some of the examples that I've shared with you and the case study that I've shared with you goes some way towards, I guess, enriching the debate and how you think about change in the journey that you have in front of you.